Hey, welcome. My name is Zach Garrett, and I'm the Education Manager for United World Wrestling, and I'd like to welcome everybody to today's webinar. The topic is important coaching skills. So we're really going to be taking a look at a couple of areas in that. One is how we're giving feedback and how we're coaching during that session, and then how do we check for comprehension. So these are just some important skills that we need to have as coaches, and really it's going to build off of the last webinar we did, which was on identifying key factors and introducing new skills. So once we've done that, what's next? After we've introduced this new technique, what are the steps now that we go to making sure that we're practicing it, coaching it, and being effective, working effectively as a coach. Now, I am going to just give you a warning as I go through this. I am back at school today. We started yesterday, so with kids in person. So we're excited to kind of get moving forward in this COVID era. But as a result of that, you are going to hear some bells ring in the background, and very possible you're going to hear some announcements being made. And when that happens, if the announcements are being made, I'll probably mute my microphone for a second. And then as a result of that, be able to, turn it back on once that announcement's done. So there may be some periodic times throughout the webinar where you just hear that sound. So I apologize in advance, and I appreciate you taking the time to be here and working through that process with me today. So again, thanks for being here, and we'll kind of get started. The first thing I would like to just remind and encourage everyone that's attending to take an opportunity to go to the United World Wrestling Academy webpage or platform and just get registered, log in, see what that's like. There's so many great resources there for coaches, for referees, for athletes. We hope that this will be a one place where they can go for many educational resources in wrestling. And as we progressively develop, this course, here are some things that we currently offer. There is an online rules test, which was great for just understanding the basics of, wrestling and how points are scored and what to expect during the course of a match. It doesn't go into great detail with some, difficult situations, but it certainly gets the basics as we go through this. The next part is that we have a few courses that coaches can take, and that is, one is the Ready to Wrestle, which is a great course just to kind of about the history of wrestling and where it's came from and where it's at now. And then also we have our first course, which is the Introduction to Coaching and Safety, which what you're going to find is many of the topics that we're discussing right now in these webinars is what you find in that course. I do know that here soon, we're going to be opening up to the Introduction to Practice Planning. So that course is almost ready to be loaded onto the platform. So we're excited about that. But we'll continually have more courses as they come up. And then also, I would encourage you to go check out the video. We have a lot of videos that are available for coaches to go and watch on techniques, and then they break those techniques down into key factors. So the points that make those moves successful. So I would encourage you to take a look at that as you go through. To get started, I think one of the first things here is this quote. Feedback is helpful and constructive, and criticism is hurtful and damaging. When we coach, do we give feedback or do we give criticism? Probably all of us will say, well, we're giving feedback, but is that really the case? What we need to start thinking about are some additional questions. First of all, what am I saying? What am I saying to the athlete? Importantly, how am I saying it? And what's my body language when I'm saying something to them, when I'm coaching them? Because it's easy to say, I can say the same thing and say it with a different tone of voice and have different body language, and it comes across differently. And what we think we may be coming across as feedback, is it really feedback, or is the athlete taking it as criticism? And I think we have to be really mindful of that as we go through this. And this is really what's going to, lead us into today is how can we give feedback properly? So our key questions of what we hope are, kind of our objectives for today is being able to answer these questions. What skills must a coach use after introducing a new technique? So what we covered last time, what are the skills the coach needs? And then we're going to look at the next part, which is what are those successful strategies for those coaching skills? So we can identify those skills, and then what are some great strategies to use to help implement those skills? Then the second part of this is going to be looking at checking for comprehension. Why is that important? And then once we identify why that's important, how can we do that? So we're going to be taking a look at some examples and getting some strategies and things to consider during this process. To get started, the first I want to take a look at, when we look at coaching skills, what we're really looking at in this process is the GROW model. So the GROW model, GROW is an acronym. So it stands for goal. So it stands for goal, reality, options, and will. So every letter means something. The last webinar we did is really, we focused on the goal part. The goal part is that new technique. It's what you want them to learn when you're coaching. So here's what we want to learn. Here's what our focus is. That's our goal. That's step number one. Then we go to the next part, which is their reality. Where are they really at? So we've introduced the technique to them. Now they're practicing it. And so where are they at when they're practicing it? So how are they performing that skill? And this is where we start to look at detecting mistakes. And that's one of those skills that we need to be able to do as a coach, is detect mistakes. The next one is, once we've detected that mistake or something we see, how can we fix it? And that next part is the options. We have to be able to provide them solutions for how to fix that technique. And sometimes, as most of you may know, your athletes, sometimes they're a little bit different. So an option for one person may not be the exact option for the next person. So we got to be able to provide some quality solutions and how we do that and how we deliver that. So we'll also talk about that as well. And this last one is the will part, which is keeping them motivated throughout practice. Because most of us have wrestled and competed before. We know that sometimes practice just gets tiring. You get down, you don't want to do it anymore. So how do we keep them motivated as they go through that process? And so we're going to look at that process of reinforcement. How do I reinforce, what we're seeing for them to keep them motivated and excited to keep practicing and keep drilling? So that'll also be something we'll be looking at. So I think this really encompasses everything that we're going to be working on today, and then with the coaching skills, and then we'll move into the comprehension part. The next part is I really like this graph. And so this graph comes from an article that was written in April 2019, which was based on goal setting and feedback and how it improves hand hygiene in hospitals, which is really interesting because given the times that we're in COVID-19, how important is hand hygiene right now, washing our hands and using hand sanitizer in the process. But it really was an interesting article and highlighted, how goal setting and feedback can be applied in this process and what's the benefit of these. So here's how this was set up. So this study was done. They installed these hand sanitation devices that recorded every time somebody used it. And they divided the hospital up into 4 groups. So they had a control group where they just installed it but didn't say anything about it, just installed it and mattered to how much it was used. They then took 3 other groups. They took one group and they set a goal for the group. Like the goal was to increase the use of the hand sanitizer. So they set a goal. So they have a goal group. They have a second group called the feedback group, which was where they didn't set a goal. They just provided daily use amounts. So how much, they posted a number of how many times it was used throughout the course of the day. Then the last group was a mixture of both. The group set a goal that they wanted to reach, and then they did feedback. They gave them daily feedback on how they were doing. And what's really interesting with this, if we take a look at this, and what I'm looking at here are the red columns versus the light blue ones, because the red column indicates the baseline. This is what they were doing before they initiated the goal or the feedback. The second thing is the part I want to look at is the post-intervention. Because we know anytime we do something that it always improves. But what we want to look at is how long does it continue after that? And the post-intervention was after they stopped doing it, what was the behavior after that? So what we saw in this result was strictly from goals only, it increased their percentage. There was an increase of 17%. So 17% more were using it after they stopped talking about the goal. So that's an improvement. So setting goals is going to make an improvement. The feedback only group saw an increase of 28%. So they saw a little bit more increase, but still there was an increase there. And this was just based on, they didn't have a goal to start with, just on how many times they were being recorded. And so if you add 17 and 28 together, you would think, okay, if I put these two together, I should get 45% improvement. But the reality is when you put these two together and you use them well, it goes well beyond that. It actually increased, they saw an increase of 58% by using goals and feedback together, which tells us as coaches, we can have the goal, we can give them the technique, and if we can use great feedback with that, gosh, our percentage of what they're going to be able to do and what they'll be able to learn is really going to increase in that process. And I know these are the numbers corresponding to this particular survey that was done, but I've also heard this as well, that goals only is 25% will increase. Feedback will produce a 25% increase, but the two of them together will produce a 57% increase. So I've heard that as well from another article. So I would encourage you to not only have your goal, but then match that with great feedback, which leads to that question. How should we provide feedback? And that's what we're going to look at today. One is, how do we detect mistakes? How do we provide solutions? Like, what are some strategies there? And then how do we reinforce? And we'll take a look at some video examples as well. So let's get started with that. How do we detect mistakes? Now, what I'm going to do here, where I optimize my screen here, there's no video, there's no audio on this particular video, but all we're looking for is, what are two things that the coach did well in the video that would help them detect mistakes? I'm going to have you watch it. I'm going to put up a poll question, and I'll have you answer, what you saw or what you thought he did well here. So here's the video. And again, our focus is on the coach here, and it doesn't matter what he's saying. What we're looking at is what he's doing. Excellent. So here we go. What are you seeing in this process? So what is the best way to detect mistakes the coach was doing? So there's 4 choices here. Which ones do you think were the best? So I'll give you a second to, make a selection here. So a couple more seconds here, and we'll share what we have here. All right, so here are results that we had for this. So moving around the mats was number 1. That is number one of the best ways to detect mistakes. If you stand in one place in one location and try to watch every group, it's very difficult to do that. And by moving around in the groups, you're able to put yourself in a better position. So that part of get to a better position is also extremely important when you're trying to evaluate how they're doing. Now, this is with young kids. We certainly know with this age group, there's going to be a lot of things they're not doing right. And what we're looking for is moving around and looking for just those 1 or 2 things that we can help correct them with in that process. And that comes largely because of sharing, moving around the room and being able to see them. So when we look at this, 2 good things to do is movement and position. Move yourself around the room because that helps make contact with each of the groups of wrestlers, especially when you have kids. You want to be able to get to each of those groups so they know that you're there. And by moving yourself, you're going to have a better chance to view how they're doing it. And it allows you to put yourself in a better position to be able to actually see see how they're doing it. All right, so strategies for providing solutions. So now we're going to take a look, and there is audio with this particular one. So I'm going to show you 2 videos, and then I want you to take a look and select what are some of the best ways that we can provide solutions for when they're making those mistakes. We need to fix it, we need to correct it. So what can we do? So we're going to watch 2 videos, and then we'll go. And these both do have audio with them.
Stay low, Eva. Good, very good. Oh, stay low, Max. Grab his hands, Max. Grab his hands. Don't let him do that. Good. Slow him down.
All right, so that was the first one. So we listened to it. And again, we're listening and watching both of these. So here's the second video.
So you're like this first before you go later. You make it like one, like so. Think of it as a line straight. So I'm going. Yeah.
All right, so we just saw both of these. So let's go back out here. And here are our choices. So what strategy did the coaches use to provide the solutions here? So which ones did you hear from these? Or which ones not only did you hear, but did you see? You should be able to select more than one, so. At least I hope maybe I didn't. All right, so I share the results. So the 3 that you selected are the 3 that we saw in this. We saw that the first coach was given simple instructions. It wasn't detailed, grab his hands, stay low. Those types of things are important. We can't give too complicated information. If it's too detailed, they can't process all the details at one time, particularly when they're trying to drill it as they go through. The second thing that was important when they were providing solutions was to be positive in that. That's exactly what we heard in this process, from here, was that they were positive. And the last one, as we saw at the bottom, Clarissa was demonstrating. Not only did she talk to him and was talking to about the position, but then she also took time to demonstrate it again and show the key point that she wanted him to work on in that process. So those are really the 3 big ways in which we want to provide solutions. 1, be positive. Keep it simple. Keep it simple in the process. And if you have to, demonstrate it again in that process. So again, a couple key strategies when you're coaching them and getting the most out of it. Because if you spend too much time going through all the details and you go through this, 1, they're not practicing it, and 2, they're going to lose track of what the main point was. So keep it simple. The last one here is reinforcement. So when we look at the videos, when we watch this, is we're looking for ways in which how they reinforced it, or they gave them that motivation to keep going. What were some things that you see in the coaches that they're doing when they're reinforcing what they're seeing, or complimenting them on what they're doing and making sure that they understand that they're doing a great job, which will keep them motivated to keep going forward. So let's watch 2 videos here on this.
Now show me wrestling stance. Okay, now go from here. Go. Nice and low. Try and tag his shoes. Very good. Okay, the Asian right there. Good.
All right, so that was the first one that we have. So let's take a look at the second one here. All right, so we just saw a couple of simple things that the coaches did that are actually very good. So let's go back to this. So what did we see, out of the first coach? Number one, he was positive again. When we're reinforcing things, we want to make sure that we're positive because that's really what's going to help motivate those athletes to keep going. The other two is that when you're reinforcing things, it's okay to give quick reminders like, hey, stay low, grab his hands, hold on, make those movements. That will help them remember what to do as they go through that. Again, simple, quick, and positive. The other thing we saw out of the first coach too in the first video was his body language. He was smiling. He was happy, was excited to be there, and that attitude is infectious to your athletes as you go. If you're excited, you're happy, you're energetic, they're going to be the same way. And that's just helping you reinforce the things that you're seeing. And the last one I thought was excellent was we can do this non-verbally. We don't have to say a lot of things for there to be reinforcement taking place. We saw the coach do two things in this process. One, he gave a thumbs up to both wrestlers. So he watched it, he gave a thumbs up to him. That is indicating to that wrestler that that coach approves. And what we have to realize as a coach, what we say matters. Coach says this. So what you say and giving them positive feedback in that and just that thumbs up really goes a long way of keeping them motivated and moving forward in that process. And he also, gave him a little pat on the back as he was doing it, like, hey, good job as he was going. Those little things, they seem like not much to us as coaches, but those steps and those processes are so critical to being able to give quality reinforcement in those things. So once you've coached it, you introduce the technique, you've gone through the process of now, detecting mistakes, you provided solutions, and now they're doing it right. Now we got to reinforce it and just give them that thumbs up, that pat on the back, that smile, like, hey, great job as we go through that. One thing I want to make sure that I mention and also cover here in this process is that we also sandwich the feedback. And we mean sandwich the feedback. What we're talking about here is the part of always try to begin when you're coaching and giving those things, that you begin with something positive, that they're doing well. Like, hey, this was a great job in this area, and be very specific on that positive. Don't say, hey, that was a good job. Here's what you're doing wrong. Because we often have times where when we indicate that positive feedback, we're very general. Hey, that was a good job. But when we're correcting something, we're very specific about it. Like, you need to run your feet on a double leg, or you need to grip the elbow better in this process. Whatever that is, our details for our correction it's always very detailed, but our positive typically isn't. And it needs to be that way. Our positive reinforcement needs to be as specific as what the correction is as well. Now, we need to make sure we sandwich the feedback. So we begin with something positive, we give a correction, and then we end with a positive note. Again, that will help reinforce them and keep them motivated to do that. And we also make sure, I would encourage you to always try to give that 4-to-1 ratio of positive to correction. So every time you give that thumbs up, that's a positive. That puts one in the bank for you. And you have to get 4 positives before we can get 1 negative. This is how we keep kids motivated. This is how we reinforce properly to keep them drilling and practicing and wanting to come back, day after day and practice after practice. The next part we want to switch gears here is to checking for comprehension. And the first question that comes up really is, why should we check for comprehension? And I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Why do we want to check? It's because we want to make sure that they know how to do the technique and they know how to do it properly and that they can be successful. And if we're not checking for comprehension, sometimes we don't know if they really know what they're doing. And it's important for us to make sure we check in that process and do that. And so next question that comes up then is, What are the best methods for retention? Like when we talk about learning and comprehension, the word here is retention. How much are they retaining? Now, this chart, which came from the National Training Laboratories and from Bethel, Maine, there's some people who argue whether the validity of this model. I can tell you from a teaching experience and being in the classroom and working with 15 to 18-year-olds, like, I don't know if the numbers are exactly right, but I would say this is pretty accurate, from that standpoint. When I see this, I can tell you that when I lecture in class, they retain very little of what I talk about. And a lot of times I feel like as coaches or as teachers, we get up and we explain all this because it makes us feel better that we covered it. But the reality is they're not retaining much of it at all. And as we go down this list, we start to see that demonstration, when we demonstrate it, that's a higher retention rate. But when we really start learning is when we get into the bottom grouping here, which is group discussion. They're practicing by them repping and getting in practice and doing it. Why it's so important that we have a 1 to 4 or 1 to 3 ratio of how much we're coaching and talking to them versus how much they're actually doing it. We want them doing it more than us talking, all right? Because we learn by practice. And then even better, if you really want to check for comprehension, ask your athletes to take their best, whatever they do best, and teach it to somebody else, teach it to the other wrestlers in the room. Because when they do that, not only are they, building a great relationship with them, but they're also learning better what they already do. Because when you have to teach it to somebody, you really have to know it. So these are some great strategies in terms of this. So how do we check for comprehension? Well, we're going to kind of focus on that group discussion part of how do we do that. So let's take a look at this. So how does the coach check for comprehension here? So again, there's a video here. He's got some questions, and I want you to listen to what he does and the questions that he asks.
Time! Good job, Tigers! Have circles for the orange right here. Fast, fast, fast! Good. Shh. Okay. Now, who has some comments about things we did good? Okay, name one thing. Or something you did good. Either one.
Something that I did good is I pushed him forward, and when he was laying down, I counted.
Good. So you were aggressive? Is being aggressive good? Or should you be running away from your opponent all the time?
Not running away.
No, you should be aggressive and keep the hammer on him, right? Very good. Ethan, what did you do?
Feet.
What did you do? Did you cross your feet this way? Or did you do nice shuffle steps?
No, I stayed on your knee and
Okay, good. Were you stronger if you stood this way or if you stood this way? Tell me. This way? Very good. Let me see your wrestling stance. Good. Excellent. Okay, how about over here? Max, what is something you did good with, let's see, your hands?
Oh, I did something with my hands. I would grab the other opponent's hand, then I would grab and like touch it.
Good, excellent. So you're more effective when your hands are out in front of you as opposed to behind you? Do we have chicken arms or elbows tight?
Elbows tight.
Elbows tight, ready to grab a hold of them, right? Very good.
All right, excellent. Coach did a great job. And I think for anybody that's on this webinar, if you've had to coach this age group, you know just how challenging this is. Sometimes we think, well, if we coach the older wrestlers, there's certainly different situations you have to deal with, and each age group poses its own challenges. But I can tell you this age group, in my opinion, is one of the most difficult ones to coach because their attention span is just not long. But the coach did some fantastic things in here. So taking a look at what he did, number one, he asked questions. So I think a part of any good coach is not only the ability to ask questions, but then number two, to follow up the questions. Like you take their answers and then you build a question off of that. A lot of times as coaches, we always want to just tell them. And sometimes we really just need to start by asking them. Ask the questions and then ask follow-up questions and keep asking more questions. And eventually you can lead them by great questions. You can lead them to the answers you want. And another thing that we saw here was that he talked to multiple wrestlers. He went around the circle and was talking to multiple ones. And the last thing I thought he did excellent was he highlighted the key factors that he wanted to get across in terms of stance, their position with their hands, and how they move. He made sure he incorporated that back into this process. So I thought that was outstanding. All right, let's take a look at another one. And I'm going to ask you these questions, and I'm going to put a poll question up after this video. And I'll be asking you these 3 questions. So watch the video and see if you can answer these 3 questions from the video.
What do you think it's important to move feet, body, and head? Why do you think it's important to move everything?
Turn your body, not feet, then you can't finish this technique. If you only turn your legs, but body is not coming with you, then also you can do this technique. If you are moving them together, then you have this, you can unbalance your opponent.
Do you have any idea what happened if I don't move? The way you talk about.
Du kan hamna utanför, eftersom jag pressar dig, jag blockerar dig här. Om jag pressar så du får exakt. Men om du tänker på
You can counter-attack you.
Okay. What do you think about important with the hook?
It's a good grip.
It's a good grip? Yes. What do you think is important with the other hook on the neck?
Control. Om när du drar mig här, så you have control.
Describing.
I cannot.
I have seen many times when kids they just do see what happened.
Yeah.
Nothing.
You don't control the situation.
This is an important key point for you to use.
All right, very good. So answering the questions here. Here we go. So you have to scroll down a little bit. So how many questions did the coach ask? You know, what types of questions did the coach ask? Would they be considered open or closed? And then who did most of the talking? Was it the coach or was it the athletes? So I'll go through a few more seconds here to give you a chance to make your selection here in each one of these. So all right, excellent. In polling here. So our results here, so we had as a group here, you know, how many questions did? Majority of you had 3, a couple of you had 4. Open questions by far, and then we had a split here of coach versus participant of who did most of the talking. So let's take a look at those results. So
What do you think
he asked was 4. So he actually asked 4 questions. They had it listed at the bottom. So here was question 1, here was question 2 as they kind of went through. So he had 4 questions in the process. So that one was there. The next part was what type of, so in a minute 20, he asked 4 questions and got responses from those 4. The next part, what type of questions did he ask? And you were right with that one. That was correct. That they were open questions, and we'll talk about what open questions are versus closed in a second. And then who did most of the talking? And I think, you know, certainly the coach is going to be doing talking during this, but our goal in this process is not to be the one doing the talking. Our goal as a coach is to ask the question and then be a great listener. You know, so in this case, the participants were doing much more of that talking during that minute 20. He would ask the question, he'd ask a follow-up question, but they kind of went around, and each of the different participants there were the ones who were doing a majority of the talking and answering those questions. And so that's an important part too as we go through this. The next question we get to is, how do we ask better questions? Because better questions provide better answers. You know, I think we have to really look at, like, really have to take a minute to ask ourselves, like, what types of questions are we asking? Because depending on how we're asking those questions, depends on what type of responses we're going to get with this. So one of the first things we can do here is ask open questions. And open questions are ones that allow the participant to explain what they have. You know, closed questions are one-word answers. They answer it, yes, no, you know, whatever number it was, that's it. Like, that's the end of it. They answer the question, and then the conversation stops. When you ask an open question, you're allowing them to explain what they saw, which then provides a higher level thinking for them, which again improves comprehension in this process. So you can see some examples of the questioning. So this actually happens to be from, we saw a couple of webinars ago where Helen Maroulis was doing a single leg to, you know, an arm drag to a single leg. And here's the same, you know, here's the key factors, and here's the questioning that would go with it as well. So, you know, which, you know, for example, in the setup, you know, which setup will we use? And then allow them to go through that. You know, how should the arm drag be performed? You know, then allows them to be able to go through and explain what they see as the key points. Such a critical part. Maybe the next skill, that maybe the most important one, is the ability to have follow-up questions. The mark, in my opinion, of great coaches and great teachers is the ability to provide a follow-up question. So you ask the first question, they give you an answer, and you follow their answer with another question that builds off of their answer. Because what you do is, you may not get the right answer to start with, but I bet your athlete knows the right answer. But you just keep going through a series of questions will get them to the point that you want them to get to. So whatever key point you're trying to make, your goal is to continually ask questions to get them to that point, because now they've thought about that process and they'll be able to do that. But great coaches can have great follow-up questions and can continually keep the dialogue going in that process, again, where they're asking questions and listening to what's being said. And then one important part here is the word choice. You know, if I ask a question and I'm not getting the right answer out of it, maybe it's not that they don't know, maybe it's that my question wasn't that good. You know, sometimes we have to realize that, again, better questions get better answers. And if I don't ask a very good question, I'm not going to get great answers. And sometimes I have to change the words that I use. So if I ask a question and I don't get a response, or I kind of get that confused look, I'm going to follow that up and think about, okay, how can I re-ask this question to get a better answer? And sometimes I have to reword the question, and I'll try it again. And if I don't, and I'm going to do this at least 3 times. Like, I'm going to go through and try to figure out 3, you know, like, here's my first question. Okay, they're not getting it. All right, what's my second question? All right, they're not getting it. I give my third question, you know, changing it up, and I'm still not getting the results. After at least 3 times, then I'll provide the answer. But not until at least I've asked 3 questions before I get to that part. Because if you've worked with any age group, particularly younger, and it may be with older kids as well, and older age group participants, you know, they're so used and so designed that somebody's always telling them what to do, that they're always just looking for the answers directly. And the one thing we have to get to is get them thinking about what they're doing and providing those answers themselves. So that kind of wraps up a little bit about what we're covering in this webinar. You know, we looked at the areas of, in terms of giving feedback, how we do that by detecting mistakes, providing solutions, and then reinforcing, you know, positive reinforcement. And then we also just, you know, at the very end of our session now, we're going to look at how did they learn what we wanted them to learn? And we looked at how we can, you know, why comprehension is important, and how we can check for comprehension and ask them better questions. So at this time, if you have any questions, now would be a great time to ask those. So if you have that, please go to the Q&A button, which is located, I think, at the bottom of your screen. So if you have that, you can simply go to the Q&A button, click open, write your question, and I'll go through and answer any questions we have, as many as I can get through. All right, I don't see a whole lot of questions here today. So, okay, there's one. So, Jess, thanks for joining today. I saw you pop up, so glad you made it. Certainly appreciate it. You know, question is, how do you keep the kids that are ahead engaged? You know, I think that's a great question, because sometimes you're going to have, and hopefully I get this question answered correctly for you, Jess. You have some different groups within the room, and how do you handle with the kids that are really advanced versus the ones who are still working? And I think that's sometimes where when it comes into planning practice, how do you plan practice effectively? And sometimes you have to have that variation. You just have to have a different group doing something different. And if you have multiple coaches, that's certainly very helpful, because you can have one coach that's just working specifically with that individual versus, with that group of athletes. And then another coach is working with a different group of athletes on maybe areas that they need to. That's something that we have really tried to do, and really practice-wise is set up our practices in such that we have our different groups based on what their needs are at that particular time. And I think that really helps keep those kids engaged, because some are so much more advanced than other ones, that's a great strategy, if you have the resources, is to be able to divide up practices and allow them to, work on the areas that they need to work on, while another group is maybe working on some basics in that process. Certainly another place too is building each athlete, especially when you're looking at more advanced athletes, when you're working with those, I think it's important that you really look at what are their main areas that they're going to do, what are their chain techniques that they're going to put together. And then you can set up practice based on, what those wrestlers need to be working on. And you develop that plan, and it allows them to work through the plan themselves, in that process. And again, that probably depends on the age group that you have, from working with 15 to 18, my 17, 18-year-olds who've been wrestling for 13 years, I can post an activity, and here's what they need to do, and here's what they need to work through, and allow them to do that. So one wrestler can be working on one thing, and another wrestler can be working on something different. So I think that's just a part of keeping kids engaged. I think particularly when some are more advanced than others, is really goes back into how you're planning practice and putting those things in place to be able to differentiate your learning across the practice room. All right, kind of wrapping up a little bit. So if we go back and we take a look at the last webinar, which was identifying key factors and introducing new skills, we're kind of putting all this together into one part here. Once we've introduced the skill, we have three processes here. One is introducing the skill, which we talked about last time. The next one is delivering the feedback, which we looked at today. Then how do we summarize and close the session? We also discussed that with checking comprehension. So these are the three main areas we've looked at over the past two webinars. And so now we're taking a look at each of these individually, just kind of going back and reviewing and how this all blends together into one part. So our first step is introducing that new skill or technique. That's our goal. That's what we want them to accomplish. So some critical just reminders for this. Number one, make sure you have a name for that. Always identify it by its name. Wrestling is largely based on terminology, and learning that terminology for that coach is important. The second one is demonstrating the skill. So you give the skill name, you demonstrate it, and then you get to the third part, which is them teaching that based on key factors. So that's what we looked at in the last webinar, was that first set. Now that we've done that, now we're ready for the second set. Now that first set typically will take us, and we should be able to introduce this in at least 2 minutes. Once we've introduced it, we take that 2 minutes, hopefully it may be under 2 minutes, then we move to the coaching and feedback part, which we know is number one, detecting mistakes. We've got to get a good reality of what's happening in the room and what they're doing practice-wise. So we do that by detecting mistakes. The next part is by providing positive solutions. We have to give them the options. This is the part in the GROW model of giving them the options, the solutions to be successful and what they need to correct it. And then the last part of this is that reinforcement part, keeping them and giving them the will to keep wanting to keep practicing and things like that. And your body language is so important in this process. And giving that thumbs up, that pat on the back, that nod of the head, they see that, it encourages them to keep moving forward. So that's the process of giving the feedback that we want to focus on. So our goals with our feedback are going to, give us a higher retention rate in this process, which is what our goal is here, is that high retention rate. And if we do the first two really good, we'll really be able to summarize this up good by checking for comprehension. So our checks for comprehension, and we do that by questioning. And we can simply just ask a few questions at the end, to get them thinking and make sure they have it in their mind. I'd also encourage, especially if you have older athletes, use the use of a journal. Every day they get done, they go journal some things about practice. What did they learn? What did they do? And they keep track of this journal throughout the course of their season. Highly recommend that as well. But again, the coach checks for comprehension, and that process takes 1 to 2 minutes. So if you look at this overall process here in this, what you notice here is this whole process of teaching a new technique from start to finish really takes about 10 minutes to do. 2 minutes of introducing the skill or less, use 6 minutes of them practicing it, drilling it, and then you're giving feedback during that 6 minutes. And then you take 1 to 2 minutes at the end to go through a little comprehension just to make sure that the checks for understanding, that they understand the key points and that they're ready to move forward in that process. So again, I'd just like to thank everybody for taking the time to be here today. We do have this webinar will be delivered in other languages as well. And so I encourage you to do that. Next week, we'll be doing this in Spanish and also in Russian. And then we're also beginning to do these in Arabic as well. And those webinars will begin a week from Saturday. We will be off for a little bit. So if you're from going through these coaching webinars, we'll be off for a few weeks. And probably in early September, we'll kind of get started with the next set of webinars, which will largely be geared on, the next set will be talking about practice planning. Like, how do we set up practices? What are some things we need to think about when we're setting up practices? And then what are some essentials that need to be in there? So we'll look at those over a series of weeks as well. So I'm certainly excited to get to that part. Some of my favorite things to talk about is practice planning and that whole concept with that, and periodization we'll get to even further down the road. So again, thanks for taking the opportunity to be here today. I certainly appreciate you making it and joining this. And I'd encourage you, if you can, this webinar will eventually be on the United World Wrestling webinar page. You'll be able to go there, and I encourage you to share that with anybody you think that might benefit from this. So thanks. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Certainly stay safe, and look forward to seeing everybody, hopefully on the mats sometime soon. So take care.